Welcome back. In a moment, we'll examine the state of democracy in the United Kingdom. First, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. Venezuela's beleaguered president has defended his decision to withdraw the country's most used banknote, saying he'd smashed the black market. The decision has led to riots and Venezuelan raiding warehouses in search of food. The woman at the centre of the political scandal that toppled South Korea's president has appeared in court. Choi Soon-sil denied corruption charges filed against her, which led to the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye. And the Irish government has accused the EU of exceeding its powers in the wake of the Apple tax scandal. The so-called sweetheart tax deal was found to contravene EU law, and the tech giant was ordered to pay €13 billion in back taxes. Ireland says the EU's competition watchdog interfered with its sovereign powers. In the first part of the programme, we looked at calls to reform the way America elects its president. But the United States isn't the only country where electoral reform is on the agenda. Here in Britain, there have been calls for a long time to change from the so-called first-past-the-post system to using proportional representation. And the current government is trying to change the number of politicians that get elected and the size of the areas they represent. At the moment, there are 650 members of Parliament. The suggested changes would reduce that to 600. Some areas that have an MP, called a constituency, would be scrapped. Most others would change in size. If the plans are agreed, it would mean each area being home to the same number of voters, just under 75,000. There are calls for further reform because critics say it's still designed for a two-party system when people no longer vote in that way. Here's how the UK looked after the 2015 general election, the different colours representing wins for different parties. As you can see, different political parties now dominate in different areas. Reformers say it no longer represents the will of the electorate. For example, in 2015, the Conservatives won the election with only 37% of the vote, but got 51% of the seats. The UK Independence Party and its then leader, Nigel Farage, won 13% of the vote, but only got one seat. And overall, the country's so-called minor parties won their highest ever support, a total of nearly 25% of the national vote. Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by Martin Bentham, who's the Home Affairs editor at the London Evening Standard. So, Martin, you've got a lot of people committing their votes. They go into the election, they're all excited about the prospect of electing somebody they like, and they see it's a complete waste of time because that big party over there went and took their seat.
Yes, I mean that does obviously happen. An awful lot of people vote for a party that that doesn't succeed. I suppose the problem is that there are plenty of flaws in a sense with the system as it operates now. It's always been the case that the ruling party gets as much as, say, 40% at best of the vote, or just around that sort of mark. And obviously that is not a majority of the vote that's cast. And that doesn't take into account the people who don't vote either, of course. But I suppose the question then comes, what's the better alternative? And that's where I think the problems then start to come in. We had a vote in this country a few years ago. The Liberal Democrats wanted to have a proportional representation system. We had a referendum on that. And at the time, I think, in the years running up to that, a lot of people might have thought that people in this country would be sympathetic to having a reformed electoral system for all the reasons you just alluded to, really. And yet that was rejected by a majority of, well, 2/3 voted against and 1/3 voted in favour. So it was absolutely conclusively rejected, because I think when people examined it, they thought, actually, it brings as many problems as it solves. And at least the merit, generally speaking, of our current system is you get a fairly clean results, and you get one party in power. Admittedly, we had a coalition in the last Parliament, but generally speaking, you have a winning party, they rule, and then come the next election, the system almost works often in reverse, that you can then hoof them out if you don't like what they've done, and it's possible to reverse that. But it is just a pendulum, isn't it? It's quite binary. It tends to be their turn, then maybe they're good enough to stay on for another 5 years or whatever it might be, and then it swings back the other way.
Let's look across to our European neighbours. I mean, France and Germany having elections in the coming calendar year. They've had some interesting... Germany, for instance, they've had a sort of permanent coalition for the last 50, 60 years, haven't they? That seems to work quite well for them.
It does work very well for them, although whether that's to do with other merits that the Germans have, their industrial skills and so on.
They're good despite their government, you mean?
Exactly. It could be an argument, but clearly they've had stability there. On the other hand, as an individual voter, if you've got this coalition in which, in essence, the forces within it, it's very hard to move them, and the deal is struck after the election as to who's going to be in that coalition. In a way, your clarity of choice becomes very difficult to try to remove that coalition if you don't like them, because there's such a strong alliance of different parties in that coalition that the odds are against you in trying to vote against it.
When the systems are so predictable, of course, as we alluded to in our conversation about America, very few people are going to vote for change, least of all the politicians who benefit from them, I suppose.
Yeah.
And now we have an interesting discussion going on about the size of constituencies and trying to make them, and that's a fairly easy formula. It should be roughly the same numbers.
Yes.
But it's not that simple on the ground, is it? Because you get bits of the country who tend to support one country, one party, I should say, and then other parts of the country, might be in the countryside or in inner cities, will tend to support another. If you start fiddling with the allegiances and the territories and the boundaries, then you get accused of fixing the system in your favour.
Yes, well, of course, exactly. I mean, if you chop a little chunk off one constituency and add it to another, then that can alter because it's a first past the post system, it can have a very big impact on that constituency. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So of course, exactly, the principle is exactly right. And of course, we've had boundary commission reviews historically. It's happened before, and it will continue to happen as populations move increasingly into the city. Well, at one point they're moving out of the city, and now they move back in. But so it's trying to adjust as the population moves to balance up the populations. But clearly, yes, it becomes very, very sensitive as to exactly how that's being drawn, because you could, it's done independently here, but of course both major parties, and in fact all the major parties, the smaller ones as well, are always trying to ensure that and fight in their corner to maintain the most advantageous division of territory for their...
But as we live in an ever more cosmopolitan, mixed society,
Yes.
With all sorts of strata and all sorts of, to a degree, and this is common in most countries in the world, some religious tensions, some racial tensions and things like that. Do you think it's important that maybe parliamentary representation, or how you choose a leader, should come to the top of political discussion once again, to see if you can get a reward for your engagement, and there is actually a connection between the citizen and the parliament that runs the place?
Well, I think, and also I think, yes, quite possibly. And I think the trouble there is that because certainly under our system, it's very hard for the smaller party to make any sort of breakthrough whatsoever. I mean, UKIP, as you said, 13% of the vote in the last election, one MP, and it's the same for any small party, whether it be the Greens, again, one MP. I can't remember what percentage of the vote they had, not as big as that, but they've had periods where they've done very well, relatively speaking, in the opinion polls. And even for the Liberal Democrats historically, they've struggled to get anything like the relevant number of seats compared with the actual percentage of the vote they've been getting. So I think that can be hard, and especially, as you say, if you've got a more sort of fragmented political discourse, actually the ability of one or two MPs at least, or a few more, to represent that in Parliament is difficult, and actually at the moment they tend to get shut out, and so you don't have perhaps that diversity on in the bigger scale of people able to do that, which perhaps is a longer term problem.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. We end with our Insight Bite, a little something that we feel you should know. Now, here's an artist in China who's gone to unusual lengths to draw attention to the country's growing pollution crisis. Wearing a mask, Liu Bolin attached 24 smartphones onto an orange life jacket and live-streamed the pollution to millions of social media viewers across the world. Liu's mobile phone creation was titled, "Today, Even Numbers Banned." In Beijing, around half the vehicles are removed from the roads when a red alert is announced and an odd-even license plate system is enforced. And that's all from me for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.